connects all things. Before your birth and after your death.
This is our home!
I need you with me. And I need you to be strong. Strongheart.
Hello and welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi. My name is James.
My name is Matt.
And we are back once again in your podcast feeds. This time we have a very special episode for you. Today we are looking at Avatar: The Way of Water.
Yes, James Cameron's sequel to his massive 2009 blockbuster Avatar. He's back 13 years later, finally, with the sequel Avatar 2, or The Way of Water. This episode is going to be completely spoiler-free, so you're free to listen to this if you haven't seen the movie yet. If you want a more in-depth spoiler chat, you can head on over to our Patreon, where we'll be posting another episode there, going into all the details of the plot and all the spoilers.
We will indeed. And in this episode, we'll also be talking a little bit about space opera, which is going to be the subject of our latest series, which is coming out in January. And of course, this is a space opera film, isn't it, Matt?
Yeah, the Avatar movies fit into this kind of the genre of the epic film. They're about this grand conflict between warring cultures, this vibrant alien world, or a moon in this case, that our character steps into in the first film and becomes part of and goes on this adventurous journey. And The Way of Water picks up after those events in the first film and shows us what's happening to that character further down the line. But that big space opera epic film clash vibe is still very much there in this sequel.
Oh, definitely. And I think the space opera-ness, if that's a proper word, really comes out in this film in particular because it is so vibrant and fantastical. And a lot of people have talked about the fantasy elements already about this particular film and what it kind of brings in that perspective. But let's talk about James Cameron first off, because regular listeners of this podcast will know we often talk about James Cameron as being one of our favourite directors, and he has got some bangers, hasn't he? He's done some amazing films in his time. His sci-fi work is so quintessential to the genre, and it's really sort of been boundary pushing in terms of the technology that's used to film it, but also just the stories just really offer something different to a lot of stuff we've seen before in terms of sci-fi. If you look at things like Terminator and Aliens and all of those really strong films that he's got in his catalogue of filmmaking. So what is it about James Cameron as a director for you then, Matt, that makes him so good at sci-fi?
I think he's just got a passion for the subject, and he's got a real eye for spectacle. That's Cameron's greatest talent. But also, when you're thinking about how good he is at creating spectacle, it's important not to forget the attention to detail in the script and the characters and the plot that he always brings to his films, and he clearly cares about an awful lot. So he can marry up those two things. I think that's what makes it so good, because sci-fi doesn't have to be high concept and spectacular and full of spectacle, but it's very entertaining when it is, or it can be very entertaining when it is. But when it leans into that, you need to have a very solid script and characters and all of the rest of it. Otherwise, everything kind of falls apart, to be honest. So I think that's what makes Cameron so good, is that's the relationship between those two skills that he has.
Yeah, you really need to have those filmmaking building blocks in order to make a film cohesive enough and fantastical enough with all the sci-fi elements to really bring audiences in. And that's the thing. Cameron is bringing back a idea that he had way back when he was a teenager, I think, for the first Avatar. I've seen interviews with him online where he talks about this dream. Often with Cameron, he has a dream and that influences his idea for a film. And previously he's talked about the fever dream he had, which influenced Terminator, which we've talked about in previous episodes. But for Avatar itself, he had this dream about this luminescent forest, this kind of rainforest, and his creatures that lived there. And that obviously inspired the first Avatar film. And I think he painted this sort of luminescent forest after he woke up, because he wanted to make sure that that dream was down somewhere. And then he goes out, he makes the first Avatar film, and then 13 years later, he's able to continue that dream and make a sequel. So we're finally getting a sequel to Avatar. We're back in the world of Pandora. We should probably talk about our experiences of the first film before we really get into the second one. So what do you remember of that first film when it came out in 2009, Matt?
I remember just enormous hype for it. I remember seeing it more than once at the cinema. I was certainly caught up in it, but not caught up in the hype. Like it was very heavily marketed and people were really excited about it, and I was kind of indifferent, I guess, and a bit more like, I didn't get the appeal because it looks incredibly strange. I think it's a hard film for people who aren't fairly open to sci-fi to get into. It looks insane. The plot's fairly insane. Not insane, but it very, very high concept, let's say. And that can be off-putting. And I suppose I was a little bit in that camp. Not that I was put off, but I just wasn't. It was too high concept for me to get excited about the idea of it just on the face of it. But, I like James Cameron, so I went along to see it and I loved it. I think it's a brilliant action-adventure movie, and I think it still really holds up. I've rewatched it before we went to see The Way of Water, and I still really enjoy it. It's just a really, really well-made film, as you would expect from James Cameron, and I think all of that holds up 13 years later. What about you?
Yeah, I've got those same feelings about it as well. And I remember it being such a spectacle, though, at the time, because it was one of the first new films to come out which was using this 3D technology and making a real big thing about bringing 3D back to cinemas. And you had the 3D glasses when you went in. Obviously, Avatar: The Way of Water is coming out as a 3D film as well, so you can go and see that. But when that first film came out, it was just it felt a bit retro as well, bringing 3D back. But the way that Cameron had done it in that first film, I remember being really struck by it because it was a different kind of experience to what I'd seen before. And I also remember the first time I got a Blu-ray player, one of the first films that I wanted to get was Avatar, because for me, Avatar was so good technically and visually. I wanted to experience that and that sort of high definition. So I think those were my first experiences of watching Avatar and being introduced to this world of Pandora. So yeah, that's the memory that I have of that first film.
Yeah, and then the lasting kind of legacy is the money, right? It's very famously the biggest box office ever. It briefly lost it, but I think it's claimed it back. It lost it to Avengers Endgame, is that right? And then it claimed it back. I'm not sure how it claimed it back. It must have been, was it a re-release in order to get the hype going for The Way of Water?
Yeah, they did a re-release, and then I think, just audiences flocked to go and see it in lots of different countries.
Do you not think that's a bit of a cheat? Do you not think it? Because you can re-release films, forever. I suppose it's fair enough if people want to pay to go to the cinema and see it again 13 years later. But I kind of feel like it's got to be that first run is what counts. Because then, Marvel can re-release Endgame. Endgame makes more money again. It goes back and forth, Let's just, we should just count it on that first run, right?
Yeah. And I mean, if we're looking at the first runs, Cameron's first run of his film before Avatar, Titanic, was stellar. That had the record first. Then Avatar comes out, beats that. So that's two films he's got which have been box office smashes. They've been in the billions. I mean, Avatar is it's surpassed 2.8 billion in box office records, which is absolutely crazy. And to have the other biggest film of recent years, Avengers Endgame, being the other competition, because Avatar isn't as well known, I would say, as like the world of the Avengers, yet James Cameron as a director and everything he's put in that first film has made it get to that kind of that box office record, which I really do, which I find fascinating, because Avengers went off the back of loads and loads of different franchise movies, didn't it? It was loads of different superhero movies building up to that one. But Avatar was just one movie, and then it went straight to the billions.
Yeah, I think that's worth noting. And it's not based on an existing property either. Even if, say, Endgame was the first Marvel film, it still would have been borrowing audiences from fans of the comic books. As it stands, it's borrowing audiences from comic books, and it's also borrowing audiences from 10 years of being fans already. And it kind of felt like the last film at the time. So everyone showed up for it like it was the last episode to a TV show. But yeah, you're right. Avatar came out of the blue, James.
Nice. Having those kind of benchmarks going in and doing Avatar: The Way of Water 13 years after, like we've said, it's a bit daunting, because you've got those kind of budgets involved in this. I mean, this has got to be like $1 billion production or something like that, because they must have put so much money into making this film. But amongst all of that, you've got things like the pandemic hit, you've got Disney taking over 20th Century Fox, so rights to Avatar changed, and I think at one point Disney weren't sure whether they would put out any of James Cameron's sequels to Avatar, because they're unknown quantities. They're not like their big franchises like the Star Wars and the Marvel films that they've got. But James Cameron's managed to get the budget and the promotion, and it's really big, all the promotion that's going on about this film, isn't there?
Oh yeah, massively hyped, as you would expect it to be, as the fairly long-awaited sequel to one of, and sometimes the most profitable movie of all time.
But we say long-awaited. Has anybody been waiting for it?
Me? Yeah. Yeah, kind of. I have to say, I love Avatar, and I love watching James Cameron make sequels to sci-fi movies. So I was really excited for it. But 13 years is a long time, and like every time I rewatch Avatar, I think, I'm really looking forward to the sequel, or I'd like to see a sequel to that. But in the 13 years in between, yeah, my enthusiasm for a sequel had kind of waned. I just sort of lost interest, But he had a big gap between the Terminators, not 13 years, and he had a fairly big gap between Alien and Aliens. He didn't make Alien, but when he made the sequel, but again, not to the degree of 13 years. He's capable of making a sequel and generating freestanding interest in that sequel, I would say.
Yeah, and it kind of put it in perspective to me, that amount of time that's passed, because we were lucky enough to go to a advanced screening of the film, and Edith Bowman was on stage introducing the film before we got to watch it. She spotted one young kid in the audience.
Oh yeah. And
he was 12, and she was like, you weren't alive when this film came out. Yeah, that just made me go, oh, I'm really old, but also it's been a long time since the first one.
An interesting point on that though, rewatching the first one, it's not dated in terms of how it looks, how it's shot, or even stuff like the technology isn't dated. The on-screen technology isn't dated, which can date very rapidly in a sci-fi movie, whether they're using like a type of communication device that's too similar to real world mobile phones in 2009. Like they nicely avoid all of that, and I don't think anything really felt dated. It just looked like a fairly classic futuristic film, and I thought that works to its advantage, certainly bringing in younger audiences to stay interested and make a franchise and keep interest in a franchise for Avatar.
Yeah, and I was thinking about my reactions to watching the first Avatar film again before going in to watch The Way of Water. And I remember when I was rewatching it, I started off being like, this is ridiculous. This is a ridiculous concept. You've got these massive blue creatures running around and then tiny little humans. Yeah. And I was worried when I went back into it. I was like, is it as good as I remember it? And then I said to you, by the end of it, I was really engaged and quite emotional after the story. So I got sucked in, and I had a similar experience watching The Way of Water at the cinema.
Yeah, and I think that's what it is. I don't think, you texted me and you said I'm such a sucker, but you're not a sucker. It does suck you in. That's the point, and it does work really well. And James Cameron's really good at that, good at sucking you in and making you go along for the ride and being emotionally invested in action movies and action heroes, and making you care about their well-being and emotionally care about the outcome of the film, and that's another reason that the first film holds up. It's another reason why his films in general are good. And yeah, I agree. It's a reason that I enjoyed The Way of Water. I mean, let's actually talk about the Way of Water then. I thought it was a very good, very enjoyable film. I had a really great time watching it.
I didn't know what to expect going in to watch this film. I stayed away from spoilers. It goes along a few twists and turns, but I was really struck by the message that it was sort of giving out as well, because you talked about making you care about the film. And as much as this is a space opera film, it's also like an ecological sci-fi as well, isn't it? In the same way that the first one was. It's very environmentally conscious. And obviously James Cameron is known for his conservation work. He's been a scuba diver for years and years. He's very interested in the ocean. And all of that comes across in the story, because you've got this world of Pandora, which is... it's under threat from the sky people, well, humans basically coming and then taking over those resources. And it's very reflective of what's happening in the real world at the moment.
Yeah, James Cameron's behind-the-scenes personal interests are in no way dampened. And he explored that in the first film, and he's clearly remained passionate about it and continues to put it on screen. And obviously, with further sequels to come, that's going to continue to be a huge theme in the Avatar franchise at large. That's clear from the first one, but he's made it very clear that 13 years later, his interests haven't changed. He explores different aspects of it in this film. It's clear where his heart is, and that hasn't really gone away in the last 13 years.
And the heart of the film as well is this story about a family. The family aspects of the story are really powerful, and sort of the way you follow those characters along the way. And I think a lot of that heart's come from the writing team as well, because you've got Rick Jaffa and Amanda Silver, who we've mentioned previously on the podcast, on our Patreon feed, when we covered the Planet of the Apes franchise. Now, they did the writing and the concept for the first new Planet of the Apes film, Rise of the Planet of the Apes, and they went on and did the other ones, I believe. Those guys, they're used to writing fantastical films which make use of motion capture, which I thought was quite interesting. So do you think they brought something different to the writing of this one that maybe wasn't in the first film? Or do you think it's more sort of like just seeing the comparisons between this and perhaps the Apes franchise?
It's very hard to say, to be honest. I'm not familiar enough with their work outside of the Apes films to make much of a judgment call there. It's very easy to look at the similarities, like you said, like motion capture stuff. Also, there's something about bringing them in to an existing property. That's essentially what was done in that first Apes reboot, and they were instrumental in rebooting that universe after Tim Burton tried and after Paul Dane was no longer working on the original series. Those similarities are there, but it doesn't feel like you're watching a film by them, and maybe people who know their other work better might see more of their fingerprints. This just feels like a James Cameron thing. I expect he was pretty dictatorial in terms of shaping this, or maybe not dictatorial, but a very strong sense of leadership from him in the world building and the writing and scripting and all of that. So he's brought in quite a lot of writers to work on this one and the upcoming future sequels. But I get the sense that that's like a sort of workload delegation thing, and he's got these people to come and work with him because he can't write. How many of it? Is it going to be 5 in total, or is it going to be 6 in total? There's at least 3 more to come after this. Yeah,
so in terms of production, they've shot all of this, all of Way of Water, all of the next one, and then half of the one after that, from what I see from interviews and things.
So that takes us up to Avatar 4, but I think there's an intention to make at least Avatar 5 as well.
Yeah, and there's lots of rumours about what would happen after that. Because, like you say, James Cameron is the director, he is the creator of this world of Pandora, of Avatar itself. And he's got so much investment in it. So I think one of the things as well he did before he got in the writing room was he had like a 800-page or something ridiculous manuscript of all of the stuff that these writers had to read to understand what was happening in this world and what it was like, and all of this real massive full-on world building that he's been doing. And I mean, he even wrote a script for what happened in the sort of like the 15 years between the first Avatar film and this one. So he's written another script of what could have been a 1.5, Avatar 1.5 before this. So he knows what's happening, what happened to the characters, how they've lived, what they've been up to. It just goes to show how much of himself he's put into this. But also, it's a big risk putting all of your effort, all of your time, all of your money into this, what could become a big franchise, but there's no guarantee. It's a lot. It's a gamble.
I agree, you're technically right, but I think also when you consider James Cameron and his whole career, he's been so successful, and it's very clear from the way he talks about Avatar that he's just deeply passionate about Avatar as a franchise, as a project, as his baby. So there is an element of risk, but the what's at stake is that he just doesn't get to make more Avatar films, but obviously what he wants to do is continue to make them. So I guess in his view, it's just, well, I'm just going to keep making them until I can't finance any more of them because I love it and I want to keep doing it, for better or worse. How old is he? Like, I don't want to get too morbid, but
he's thinking about it though, isn't he? He's obviously got it on his mind because he wants to create this entire world, and he wants to finish it, doesn't he? Obviously.
Yeah, so the risk to him really is that he doesn't get to make as many Avatar films as he would like to make, but what he has to put on the line then is just attempt to make, or just continue to make, as many as he is allowed to do. And if he's got no, what's the worst that can happen is that even if he made an absolute stinker, a true stinker of a movie, in a few years he'd get financing to make another movie. It might not be an Avatar one if it was that one that absolutely tanked, but he's still James Cameron. He's got enough under his belt that he could make more films. So I don't think it's a huge risk. I think this is what he wants to do, and this is what he's going to continue to do until Disney, Fox, whoever owns the rights, or even himself, I guess, self-financing until he cannot make any more. Yeah,
and also just seeing sort of some of the behind the scenes stuff that they've been doing, he's not just trying to make a sequel to Avatar. He's trying to change the film industry in some ways as well, because there's all this tech that they're creating and they're looking into to make sure that they can make the best film possible. It's moved on leaps and bounds in terms of the way that they've got motion capture from the first one. The attention to detail in the characters' faces when you're watching this film is insane, and you totally believe that these Na'vi, these alien creatures, are real when they're on screen, because all of the acting, like Kate Winslet's character, she's talked about this in interviews as well. It's so much more intense than doing a normal acting scene, because you've got thousands or hundreds of cameras all over you looking at every single move your muscles make in your face. So you're suddenly paying attention to all of that in your acting. Like every glance you make, all of it is being recorded, so that when it comes down to making the film and what you see on screen, it's got to be so precise in terms of the acting as well.
Yeah, as a technical challenge as an actor, it must be pretty awful, to be honest. Like just motion capture in general. I guess if you're not familiar with it, we've got Sam Worthington and Zoe Saldana, who it's been 13 years, but made one of these films and have experience as a motion capture actor. It must be really hard, but also this has been a really long development. So all of the coaching that people like Kate Winslet would have received in how to give a good motion capture performance has clearly paid off because, you've got so much detail in it that all of that nuance is captured, all of that facial performance is captured in the motion capture, making it look great and making it look like a great kind of live performance, which must have been incredibly difficult on the actors and the technical crew copy and pasting that onto a blue face or whatever. But it all comes together very nicely and very seamlessly, so it just looks like a good performance on screen, which is what you want from your actors, really.
And it all adds up because they even did stuff like because obviously you've got all of these actors running around in this motion capture suits with all of these cameras on, like I've said, but they've created a way that you can see. So they've got like monitors that James Cameron and everyone backstage can look at, and they can see what it will look like animated. And yes, it's obviously not the full animation that you're going to get, but you can see the perspectives so that he can frame all of the shots how he needs to. And you can see it when like a human character walks behind one of the Navi. It's all sort of mapped out. So that they can see it on the monitor, which helps again. But then you add in all of this amazing underwater stuff that's happening in this film. I mean, the film's called The Way of Water. You're going to expect some underwater scenes.
And Cameron is obsessed with water as a filmmaker.
He loves it. He bloody loves being in the sea and stuff.
Obsessed with water and obsessed with technology and improving technology to capture water better on film is like one of the defining things of his career is just filming liquid in interesting ways. Basically, he keeps revisiting it, and this is the current apex of that cinematic journey, filmmaker's journey that he's on, which is just having a film that is about 50% set underwater or just has a lot of scenes underwater.
But there are two things that shouldn't go as well, because you don't want to throw expensive technology underwater. But that's exactly what he's done.
Well, he does that in his private life as well. Yeah,
he just loves to
for fun.
Yeah, he's just chucking it all underwater, and then also he's making his actors go underwater for an excessive amount of time. So I think most of them were able to hold their breath for about 5 minutes by the end of it, with all the training they had. And it's been documented as well that Kate Winslet broke Tom Cruise's underwater filming record that he did in Mission Impossible Rogue Nation in 2015. So she did about 7 minutes and 14 seconds, it says here. I mean, even if she did just over 6 minutes, which is what Tom Cruise did, that's insane. Like holding your breath underwater for that amount of time and doing whatever you need to do for that scene, it's just crazy.
That is truly going to piss off Tom Cruise. You know, you know he's not going to be happy about that.
Yeah, he's going to shoot an entire underwater film.
Yeah, we're going to see a watery Tom Cruise film in the next few years, for sure.
Waterworld 2 with Tom Cruise. Yeah, it's going to happen. But yeah, and also the way that they're animating this water. They had to look at different ways to animate the water. All of these crazy things that they've done to really put this film together. And I mean, the spectacle is there. When you go and watch this film, you should. I would say go and see it at the cinema, because you really do get all of this detail in there on the screen.
And as with any James Cameron movie as well, it's so much about pure spectacle that it's a film worth seeing on the big screen, as all of his films would be. Do you think that all pays off in the film, the underwater technology and all of that's been invested in over the last 13 years by Cameron and his studio and colleagues that work with him? Do you think has it all been worthwhile?
I think it looked amazing, sort of from my perspective, but the thing I do think about, and I know Cameron has often said about this, is when it comes down to it, audiences don't care about the technology. Mm-hmm. They want a decent story. So all of this amazing spectacle and the visuals, which I loved, I think they will capture people's imaginations. But I think a lot of people will go and watch this and not be as struck by how technically good it is, but they will just be in the world of Pandora, which I think is the main thing. And that's what you want in any good film. You want to be in that world and in that sort of escapist setting. So I think that's where this is good. And when you've got like so much other stuff going on in the world at the moment anyway, I think people need a bit of escapism.
Yeah, I have to say it's hard to argue with the end result, which is good, enjoyable escapism. Because I was sucked along for the ride, as I always am with a Cameron film, and I enjoyed that ride. But there were moments where I was sort of watching the underwater scenes and thinking about the technology behind it, not knowing, what that technology involves, but knowing that, it's been hyped up by most of all by James Cameron himself in interviews, and waiting 13 years for the technology to catch up so he can do this stuff. But I was just thinking, like, does this look better than, for example, a fully CGI animated underwater scene, or just any other underwater scene? I think there's stuff like what we were talking about the nuance of the motion capture on the actors' faces is just as good underwater as above water. So presumably it was underwater motion capture being used.
Yeah.
And that's very impressive. But again, I caught myself thinking, like, but what if it was just motion capture on land with a green screen, and then you put it underwater with CGI? I wasn't totally sold that, like, this film required 13 years of underwater camera technology development in order to be made, because everything's CGI, so just do it CGI. Similarly, I don't know, I mean, what did you think of the 3D? Because I basically felt the same way about the 3D. It looks amazing, like Avatar did 13 years ago. It's one of the best examples of a 3D film I've seen, but I don't really think it adds anything to the experience. And I felt that way about Avatar 1 as well. How did you feel about that?
I think it's tricky because it's not one of those things you can easily recreate in any environment. You have to be at the cinema watching it. I mean, I did enjoy the 3D. There are certain shots which it really gets you in that world. You've got stuff coming at you, and I know that's the whole point of 3D anyway, like having stuff in your face. But there's moments like in the jungle, and sort of there's a few scenes, few really exciting scenes towards the end when you've got lots of stuff, sort of like you see the characters moving around through things. And it's almost the camera's like just behind them, or you're seeing from their perspective. There's an amazing moment where you see from the perspective of one of the younger characters, and they're peeping through a tent. And that moment really struck me with the 3D because it felt like I was there from that perspective. But I don't know if you can still recreate that just in the 2D version.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
That's what focus is for.
But like, I don't know, there was something about that moment and a few other moments which were really great. But I think the medium of 3D is such an interesting one because there was that massive movement around when Avatar came out, and then everyone was buying 3D TVs. I say everyone, people which had a lot of money to spend.
Yeah.
They were buying 3D TVs. I know my sister went and got one just because of the novelty. And
most of those 3D TVs are in landfill now. Like,
yeah.
Do you know anyone who's still
that.
got? Has your sister still got her 3D TV?
No one that I know has the time to watch anything on 3D.
Getting their little battery-powered glasses out of the drawer and watching one of the 3 films they own on DVD. You know,
Yeah, but then there were lots of films which came out at the time which were shot for 3D, like Life of Pi, Hugo. These were like really strong films that had those 3D elements in, but also production companies don't want to pay extra to get the 3D made if it's not going to be a novelty that the people are going to really buy into. But James Cameron is so obsessed with this idea of 3D and the way that we look at things in reality anyway, and sort of frame rates. And for me, I'm not as bothered about that because the medium of cinema is escapism. So I don't need it to be ultra realistic. I just need to be in that world when I'm watching it. But saying that, I did enjoy the 3D at the cinema when we watched The Way of Water, and like it was an experience that I wouldn't have if I was watching it at home.
Yeah. I'm just not sold on it. I've never been sold on 3D. I've always been consistently disappointed by seeing films in 3D at the cinema.
Do you not like the glasses? Is it the glasses?
I don't mind the glasses. I don't know. It gives me eye strain. Maybe I'm just biased because of that. Like, it makes my eyes feel uncomfortable, and it always has. And even like really high quality 3D, like the Avatar films, give me a bit of that. But I don't think that's colouring my opinion. I genuinely think it doesn't add to the quality of the filmmaking. It's just you can just go fully like gimmicky with it and have lots of scenes where characters throw stuff directly at the camera and stuff like that. Or you can not be overly gimmicky and just have it adding this sense of actual depth, literal depth to the scenes. The gimmicky stuff is annoying. I think everyone finds it annoying, or a lot of people do. That's why we don't see a lot of 3D films anymore. And then the other stuff just doesn't add very much. So you've got these two things. One of them's annoying and one of them just doesn't really add much. And I think that's why 3D films went away again after that big boom around 2009. And I don't think they're going to come back to stay because of this film. But we talked about the mythology of James Cameron, and this obsession with technology and this obsession with camera technology and shooting underwater and shooting everything with 3D cameras that he's seemingly invented single-handedly on his submarine or whatever. Like, I like all that. It's fun. It adds to the story, doesn't it? But it doesn't impress me, I guess.
So 3D is clearly a bit of a bugbear for you then, coming off the back of this, just in general. So, but I know one of the other big bugbears you have are long run times, Matt. We talked about this many, many times. And obviously going in, people have already been a bit daunted by the length of this film. It's 3 hours and 12 minutes. And I would say I didn't really notice the length. I think part of me was always thinking, is there going to be another act coming at the end of this, because I know it's going to be a long film, but I didn't really find the runtime a problem. What about you?
It feels long.
Standard Matt comment.
Yeah, I was enjoying it throughout. I felt the same way rewatching the first film, which is I watched the extended cut, and that's just shy of 3 hours. But I enjoy it throughout. James Cameron said something really interesting when the runtime was announced. He was like, I don't want to hear anyone whining about it. People just need to accept that it's okay to get up and go for a pee during a film, which is quite an interesting thing to say. And he's got this attitude that, like, well, you're going to see it again, so you can just catch it again. And that's fine when you're trying to chase a box office record that you want people to come back a second time. But also, like, just saying that it's fine to get up and go for a pee, which I did twice during this film because we were given beers at the screening. That's all well and good, and that's easy to do when you're watching the Blu-ray at home of the first film. But he's not exactly like putting a message on screen saying, like, this is a good time to go for a wee if you need one. There's going to be 5 minutes of mostly exposition, or, well, no, you can't miss the exposition. I don't know, like, what would you miss? You missed something, and we'll talk about it on the Patreon episode because I don't want to spoil it for people. Yeah. But you also went to the loo and you missed something. So you're always going to miss something. But yeah, he doesn't seem to care about that. It's just weird. Like, you've poured your heart and soul into this film, and then you're like, it's okay to pop out for 5 minutes. I don't mind. Come back in.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, isn't it? But I think it's the same with any film. And I mean, it's just different when you go to a cinema, and people just I feel like people need to get over that a little bit, because you're not at home, you've not got your little TV screen or big TV screen, whatever you've got, whatever your home entertainment system is, where you can pause it, go to the loo, come back. It's something about that having to be there and watch it, and then if you need to go, you just need to go or whatever, and just sort of being in the moment of it, being in that sort of present. And also, I always remember this is something which we got taught, I think, when we were studying film at uni, and we were talking about historical epics.
About the economic kind of the economic benefits of a long film.
Yes, it was that, but also just the sort of the fact that they're so long, you feel like you've been on this journey, you've been through this historical epic yourself, because you've got a numb bum, like in these old school cinema seats, and you've been sat there and you've really experienced it for that amount of time. And people will put on a TV show and they'll watch like 10 hours or something ridiculous. They'll just be like, I'll just put on one more, here we go. And they won't bat an eyelid. But then when you've got a film which is 3 hours, there's suddenly a big problem.
Yeah, and there's also that aspect that I remember talking about this, I think at uni or around that time, about those kind of epic historical movies, or just epic movies in general, and the links to economic downturns, and that when there's like a depression, people may be more interested in seeing a much longer film at the cinema, like Gone with the Wind, or perhaps Avatar off the back of the 2008 financial crash, because you just feel like you're getting your money's worth. You know, if things are tight and you've got to spend whatever it is to, whatever a cinema ticket costs in your area. If it's 3 hours and 10 minutes long, maybe you leave thinking like, all right, well, I didn't just waste 15 quid or whatever it is. I feel pretty good about spending that because I got a lot of film out of it, not like a sort of throwaway 90-minute action flick that I don't really care about that might be more popular in periods of economic stability.
And look, listeners, there's a UK energy crisis at the moment. If you find a nice heated cinema, go and watch Avatar, The Way of Water for 3.5 hours, whatever it is, and then you'll be nice and warm for a bit.
Yeah. And it's an interesting theory and an interesting bit of like economic film analysis. I don't think that could have been foreseen. And I also don't think James Cameron had it in mind, certainly not like a deliberate thought process, because he couldn't have foreseen the current economic situation. But whether it means that more people go and see it for that reason and it becomes more successful for that reason, it's kind of hard to say until 10 years from now and we look at kind of movie lengths and what was popular and what people went to see.
Well, cinemas looked like they were going to collapse at one point, didn't they? After the pandemic, it looked like cinemas were just done and we wouldn't have any more cinema. There'd be no sort of theatres to go to where you can watch these films.
But Christopher Nolan fixed that with Tenet. But yeah, there might be an element of that, trying to rebuild cinematic spectacle with underwater stuff. But again, he was working on all the underwater stuff and he would have been shooting it in 3D regardless of the pandemic and regardless of the impacts on the cinema industry. So all of that was already there.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a blockbuster. It is an epic. You've got lots of stuff going on in this. Some of the action is quite localized at points, but it does get quite spectacular in certain moments, which I'm not going to get into. But do you feel like this film is similar to the story of the first one without giving too much away? And does it offer a different kind of spin on things?
It is very faithful to the first film, and it feels like a natural sequel in terms of where the directions that the plot goes, while also keeping the elements of the first film that I think people will enjoy, or, keeping a lot of familiar elements of the first film and the plot structure. There's enough there that it's doing that thing that sequels do where it takes what works in the first film and it builds on that. What I would say is that, I don't know how you felt, but while I really enjoyed this film, it doesn't quite stand up to expectations you might have of James Cameron making a sci-fi sequel. So basically, this isn't what Terminator 2 is to Terminator, and it's not what Aliens is to Alien. It's more just like a good sequel, and that's a little bit hard to adjust to if you've been waiting 13 years hoping for the next Terminator 2 or Aliens from James Cameron. This is a good sequel to be honest, a better film.
Yeah, you're right, though. It's not... With the examples of Terminator 2 and Aliens, he's flipping the script. He's doing something completely different to the first film.
Yeah.
This does have a lot more similarities to the first Avatar film. But I think part of that is because this is part of a group of sequels which are due to come out. So I imagine that at some point there's going to be a flip that Cameron's going to do that no one's going to expect, and it's probably going to be in one of the sequels. But needless to say, this is still an amazing film, and I really enjoyed it. And the world building, again, it expands on the world of Pandora. You see different creatures, you see different clans, you see the human characters developed in a slightly different way. There's lots of stuff going on in this, but it's still quite localized in its story. And at its core, it's about a family. And like we said earlier, it's kind of ecological sci-fi.
Did it leave you wanting more, James? Because there will be more of these, as we said, at least 3 more, maybe 4 more, maybe 5 more, as many as they're going to let him make, I think. Are you excited for more sequels, or at least for Avatar 3?
Yes, I am definitely wanting more Avatar after this, because I feel like there's so much more of the story that they're teasing at in this one. Like, in a way that you can still watch this and not be like, oh God, it's a massive cliffhanger and I need to know what happens next every 5 seconds. There's lots of stuff that they're putting in here, which you can see the seeds of a story that's going to grow out after this one in the subsequent sequels.
The whole film is a big step in world building on Pandora, which implies that there's more to come, doesn't it? And you were saying about how James Cameron had written this whole 13-year story of what's going on in the interim. It makes me hopeful that there's going to be a next stage to that, and we'll continue to see more of Pandora, learn more about Pandora, or just have interesting sort of things to do on Pandora. Things to do on Pandora when you visit. Yeah, I think there's plenty more to go, and yeah, I hope that he can sustain a good enough level of quality that Disney keeps signing the checks for the next 10 years or so.
Yeah, well, fingers crossed. And there is also plenty more to come on Avatar: The Way of Water. We're going to be continuing our chat over on Patreon, where we'll be doing a full spoiler-filled discussion on the film. So once you've seen it, come and join us on Patreon, and you can hear the second half of this chat.
We hope you'll join us for that. And we also hope you'll join us very soon as we return to your main feed with Series 6 of Journey Through Sci-Fi, which is all about space opera, coming very soon in January.
Yeah, so keep a lookout for that. That's it from us. We'll see you again soon.